For anybody who's not joined our talks before, I should introduce myself. My name's Stuart, and I'm the curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon, where I look after this internationally important collection of artefacts relating to the life and times of Oliver Cromwell, one of the most significant, some might say, infamous figures in British history. And it's our job to try and tell that story, warts and all. This programme of lectures helps support the running costs of the museum. We are an independent charity. It also as well helps spread all sorts of knowledge and interest about this particularly fascinating and significant period of history. So for tonight's talk, back in July, we took our team of volunteers out for their summer jolly as a way of saying thank you, and we decided to go to Norwich for the day. We did so in order to go and visit the excellent exhibition that was staged at Norwich Castle Museum on the wreck of the Gloucester, Cromwellian warship that went down off the coast in the 1680s, nearly taking the future James II down with it. And the shipwreck was rediscovered some years ago, and a remarkable series of artifacts has been flowing in since then, and this excellent exhibition staged that. We were very lucky that day to also catch a lecture by our speaker tonight, Dr. Ben Redding from the University of East Anglia, who was doing a talk as coincidentally on the Gloucester during Cromwell's Western design. Ben was such an interesting and excellent speaker. We got in touch with him immediately there afterwards to see if he'd be willing to come into our autumn lecture programme to give a slightly expanded version of the talk he gave then, which also hopefully will have the additional benefit that we didn't have that day, which was this building site that was Norwich Castle Museum. Ben's talk, I can see some of my volunteers nodding, Ben's talk being interrupted by the sound of hammer drills in the background, for which he was profusely apologetic and yet battled through valiantly. So without those interruptions this evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ben this evening. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. And yes, there is no planned banging intended for tonight's talk. Okay, so that shouldn't be an issue. Right, so I'm just going to go and share my screen now, and hopefully it all goes through. You should have it in a second. Is that worked? Everyone seen my PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right. Ironically, just as we were sitting, as you was all entering the room, I heard a couple of jokes about Cromwell and Christmas, as is very typical at this time of year. And ironically, the very first thing we'll talk about today is Christmas, because what actually happened, it was Christmas Day in 1654 that the English Armada set sail from Portsmouth for the West Indies in what's come to be known as the Western design. So, as is very typical, yes, of course, it was just another work day, and it was indeed on Christmas Day that they did set sail for Caribbean, what was really just one of the most ambitious military feats, really, up to that date. So yes, what followed is known as the Western design, which was an English offensive effort in the Caribbean to capture Spanish holdings to enhance Oliver Cromwell's newly established Protectorate. It was, though, a colossal and costly failure. It was characterised by questionable leadership, disunity, sickness and death, and general discontent amongst those who participated. I sound like I'm really selling it here. Indeed, the grumpy face you can see on one of these Bellarmine jugs on the current PowerPoint slide, which these are two Bellarmine jugs from the Gloucester shipwreck. That nice grumpy face there really kind of foreshadows the attitudes of the ship's crew that we'll discuss today as part of the Western design. I think today the failure of the Western design is seen as almost like a turning point in history. It was kind of perceived as the beginning of the end of the Republic, because it showed that Cromwell and his followers actually weren't invincible. They could lose. They weren't always going to win. And this paper provides the first study of one of the warships that was involved in that important scheme, that being, of course, as Stuart has just mentioned, the Gloucester. Now, of course, as you will know, the kind of reason for this paper is the discovery of the Gloucester. Now, that was found in 2007 by Junior Lincoln Boundwell. You could see them either side of myself and my colleague, Professor Claire Jarrett, there on the slide. And yes, they found the Gloucester shipwreck off of Norfolk in 2007, and since then have been kind of since they've been trying to attempt to ensure that they can confirm the identity of the wreck, and then they've been working with various authorities to ensure that it's both protected and to ensure its future. And it was only actually last year in 2022 that myself, my colleague Claire, Professor Jarrett, and the Boundwell brothers announced to both to the world that this shipwreck had been discovered and that there were big plans for it. The shipwreck was lost in the ship was lost in 1682 when it was transporting James Duke of York and Albany, the future James II, to Edinburgh. James had recently been exiled from England because of his Catholic beliefs, but finally in 1682 he was invited to return permanently, and he was actually going off to Edinburgh to collect his wife Mary Medina, who'd been in Edinburgh all that time. He was going to collect his wife, settle his affairs, and then return to London permanently. But of course, the Gloucester never got there. It struck a sandbank and was lost within an hour, with the loss of many lives as a result. And when we announced the discovery in June last year, it received such a fantastic reaction. It became not just a national, but it became a global story of huge interest. Indeed, the four of us were sitting on Great Yarmouth Beach over 2 days, being interviewed by the press and getting very sunburned in the process. But it really showed that there was a huge public interest, not only in naval history of this period, but of 17th century history more broadly. And that ship, the Gloucester, I'm going to highlight to you today, actually is so very significant, not just for its loss in 1682, but to its wider contribution in history, including the topic of today's talk. Today's talk is also funded. Fortunately, I'm part of a lovely project at the moment, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, to research the life and times of the Gloucester, and the end result will be a lovely kind of book on the ship's career. So today's structure of the talk, we're going to start by outlining the Gloucester's career and kind of highlighting its kind of main characteristics, its main features. Then we'll have a quick overview of the Western design itself, what actually happened there. Well, then the main centre of the talk will be on actually what went wrong there, because it wasn't a great prosperous story. In fact, it was a bit doom and gloomy. So what went wrong with the Gloucester and its crew? And to answer that, we're going to look at kind of the unrest and what unfolded, and an attempt to understand the kind of mutinous developments that ended up occurring there on the Gloucester, which we'll discuss later. Okay, so as I've mentioned, we know today the Gloucester principally because of its shipwreck. But because of this fantastic research project I'm currently on, we're actually learning so much more about the ship's entire career. For example, it was a Cromwellian warship. It was originally commissioned to be built in December 1652 as part of the First Anglo-Dutch War. And actually, during the Cromwellian period, it's involved in a number of major conflicts, including the Anglo-Spanish War, and it actually sees action in theatres in the North Sea, off of North Iberia, and in Scandinavia as well, in addition, of course, to the Caribbean. But of course, today we're going to be looking at what I would probably argue is perhaps one of the most interesting and significant contributions of the ship to our history, which is when it travelled to the Caribbean and contributed to the rise of the British Empire and also to global geopolitics, which really continues to have ramifications today. So the Gloucester, as I just mentioned, was constructed in December. It was commissioned for construction in December 1652 because England was at war with the Dutch Republic. And the idea was it was intended to be launched while the war was ongoing, and so that the Gloucester was going to be used to fight in the Great Dutch War. But ironically, it never actually got to that stage. The Gloucester was launched in early spring 1654, and that war had ended in April. So by the time actually the ship was ready for combat, the war had finished. But that is the purpose of the initial purpose of the ship. It was designed to fight in the First Anglo-Dutch War, a war largely about trade. But the ship itself was built as a much larger building program, it must be added. In fact, in December 1652, the Gloucester was just one of 30 frigates designed to be built, which were a combination of both third-rate warships, which the Gloucester was, and fourth-rates as well. They're meant to be 30 new warships being built, which was really quite an impressive feat. And actually, this was kind of part of the Cromwellian regime. The Cromwellian regime contributed so very much to the Navy because it expanded on an unprecedented rate. To give you a kind of idea, roughly, at the end of Charles I's reign, there was perhaps around 40 to 50 warships owned by the state, but by 1660 there was perhaps 150. So there really is quite a substantial expansion in the Navy at this time, and the Gloucester is a key representation of that. Because there was such a large expansion of the fleet, it consequently needed more and more different shipyards to actually be employed to build these ships. And as a result, the Gloucester wasn't actually built in one of the state shipyards like Chatham or Deptford. It was instead built at Limehouse, a private dockyard, and it was built by a family of shipwrights known as who were called the Graves family. Now, the Graves, I kind of consider them as quite comparable to the more famous Pett family. They had a long history in shipbuilding. Had certainly goes to the late 16th century that they kind of they've been building ships in Limehouse from. And yes, the Gloucester was launched in early spring of 1654, and its first captain was an individual called Benjamin Blake. And that name may mean something to many of you because Benjamin Blake was the younger brother of the general at sea, Robert Blake, of course, kind of like the naval, the Nelson of the 17th century, really. And yes, it was Benjamin Blake, the younger brother of Robert Blake, who was appointed as the ship's first captain. Very quickly worth mentioning as well that all these ships were named after Commonwealth battles, or they were named after things related to Parliament. Other examples being the Marston Moor and the Torrington at the time. And the Gloucester was the same. The Gloucester was named after the Siege of Gloucester of 1643. And so, yes, these warships were designed to reflect this kind of new ideology around kind of Parliament's superiority. It was quite a large warship as well. It was armed with about 54 cannon upon launch and had around 300 crew. And it's had a keel length of about 117 feet, which makes it a couple of feet larger than the Mary Rose as a point of comparison. But it was smaller than that other Cromwellian shipwreck we know of, the London being a second-rate warship. And you can also see on this lovely drawing by Van der Velde the Elder, which dates to the kind of early 1670s, we think, that it has a figurehead of a lion on, and in the restoration, of course, when 1670 would have been 1673, in the restoration, the figureheads were crowned lions. They had a crown on the head, but here it doesn't have a crown on its head. It has a plume, a scroll on it, which was actually what the Commonwealth used. It was what was used during the 1650s, and so that figurehead seems to have remained on the ship thereafter. Right, so the point was here the Gloucester was a large ship. Okay, it had around 300 people on it. That was its kind of roughly standard size for the crew, and 54 guns. Those guns were largely divided between two decks. It was known as a two-decker, its main and gun deck, while having an all-up deck below and its hold, and then of course it also had its quarterdeck as well. But despite this kind of large size, the ship was quite claustrophobic, I think you could say the least. You imagine 300 people on this kind of space, and not only that, 300 people who would have been on there without any kind of liberty to get off for more than a month at a time, when of course it was traveling across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. I think that's quite an important point to kind of make here, really, because warships were claustrophobic. They were a very intimate setting, and you had very little space, and that is it would be quite easy in that setting to develop anger and hostility, just by being in that kind of awkward, squalid condition for so long. And that's something that we'll kind of come back to later. So really the kind of question was, when the Gloucester was built and the war had ended, the question was, what do you do with these new warships? They've been built, the country had invested a lot of money into them. They can't just sit there idly now. And the answer came with the Western design. Now, the Western design, as I say, was one of the most ambitious military schemes in early modern history, where a squadron commanded by General at Sea William Penn of some 38 warships departed from Portsmouth in December 1654. And on board that was 3,000 soldiers divided into 5 regiments. And you can see on the board here this document from the National Maritime Museum, and this lists those original 38 warships that were sent to the Caribbean. And the 5th ship down is the Gloucester, and you can see it was listed as a third-rate ship, and originally it had 280 seamen on board, 30 soldiers, and 54 guns. And there is Captain Benjamin Blake as recorded as its commander. Now, I think this number is quite significant for the division of the individuals on board, because 30 soldiers isn't many for a warship of the Gloucester size, especially when you compare it further down the list to the smaller vessels. Let's take a 5th rate, for example, like the Gillyflower. The Gillyflower, there you can see 3rd, 4th from the bottom, 55 seamen, but 130 soldiers. Now, I think that's important because it does show what the purpose of the Gloucester was in the Western design. It wasn't intended to be used just to kind of transport troops over. It wasn't a taxi. It was actually there to be a warship. It was there to defend the soldiers being transported. It was there to arm the seas in the Caribbean. And I think that is quite important, because usually the Western design is perceived as being a conflict was largely fought on land, and it was an army, a failure of the army. But actually, you look at the Gloucester and its purpose here, and it's quite clear that the Navy is quite important to it as well. And of course, the Gloucester is clearly seen here as one of the very largest warships that was assigned to the fleet. So to summarise events in the Western design, the ultimate result of the expedition was really a failure. It was a failed assault on the island of Hispaniola, which is today known as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And after that failure, there was a successful subsequent attack on the island of Jamaica in May 1655, when the island was captured. But following Jamaica's capture from its Spanish inhabitants, the commanders of the campaign, which was William Penn for the Navy and Robert Venables for the Army, then chose to return home, together with a large contingent of the fleet. Now, traditional narratives of the Western design usually end with their return home in the summer of 1655. Yet, I would argue here that the expedition actually continued long after that, as a large garrison of many of the warships, including the Gloucester, did remain in the Caribbean. It did remain principally in Jamaica. And in fact, when looking at the Gloucester story thereafter, you find out that the Gloucester actually has quite the story to tell when you look at what happened to its crew once Penn had left. But first, let's very quickly trace over the Gloucester's time spent in the Caribbean from beginning all the way to its end in a bit more detail. So when the Gloucester departed with the fleet from Portsmouth in December 1654, it reached the island of Barbados, which had recently been reacquired by Parliament. It was a royalist island, but it had been reacquired by Parliament by a small fleet of 7 ships in 1651. So now it's a parliamentarian stronghold, and the Gloucester reached the island at the end of January 1655, so it took slightly over a month for them to cross the Atlantic. The fleet then remained in Barbados for 2 months to strengthen and prepare for an assault on the key Spanish holdings in the Caribbean, although actually it remained secret as to what the actual targets were within the Caribbean. They didn't actually inform most of the commanders what the islands of attack were going to be. By the time they left Barbados, the fleet had actually been expanded largely by capturing Dutch prizes sailing around the area, and the fleet had expanded to about 60 ships, while the army that it was carrying had been expanded largely by conscripting the inhabitants of Barbados and the surrounding kind of English islands such as St Kitts, and they conscripted the people living there who were largely Scottish and Irish inhabitants. So then what followed was that assault in Hispaniola, which I kind of mentioned, and it's kind of quite important to explain kind of what's happened tactically on the island, because it actually is important to explaining what happens in the Gloucester subsequently. So the plan was, on approaching Hispaniola, they were going to attack the chief city there, a city called Santo Domingo. The idea was that the fleet was going to split. It was going to split into two different contingents. One eastern contingent to attack the eastern side of the city, and one to attack the western side of the city. And the western contingent was going to be the largest of the two. Well, the Gloucester was assigned to the western part there, and the western part was, for the Navy, was going to be commanded by the Vice Admiral of the fleet, an individual called William Goodson, who's quite important to our story thereafter. The plan was that the western part of the fleet was going to sail to the River Haina, which was a couple of miles west of the city itself. And there it was going to disembark all the troops, and they were then going to assault the city directly, while the ships would be fired at the fortifications of the city by land. But when they actually reached the River Haina, the decision was quickly made that they were no longer actually going to land at that agreed place, because Vice Admiral William Goodson claimed that he saw a chain lying across the river that would have stopped them from actually sailing into that area to disembark. That view was contested. No one else actually believed him that there was a chain there in the first place. But because he had ultimate kind of rank, he called rank, being the naval authority there, the fleet carried on sailing. And in fact, they actually ended up sailing some kind of extra 30 to 40 miles away to a different location known as the Point Nizel. And you can kind of see that on this left map here. It's just kind of like the most southern point of the island, kind of, there's like a kind of peninsula there, and that's kind of where Point Nizel was. So they ended up disembarking some 40 miles away from where they originally agreed, so really quite a considerable distance. And actually that decision was really quite pivotal to their failure at Hispaniola, because what happened as a result is it meant that all the troops who disembarked had to march over land some 40 extra miles in heat and without the provisions, which meant that actually by the time they actually got back to the original place they wanted to disembark at the River Haina, they were exhausted, and many of them were dying just because they hadn't got the resources to survive. As a result, the army was done for before they even begun their assaults, and consequently, by late May 1655, the decision was made that they were actually going to, sorry, not late May, by late April, the decision had been made that they were going to abandon the assault altogether, because people were dying. The Spanish had been quite savvy. All the wells around the area, they'd slaughtered horses and thrown the corpses into the wells to poison them, so the English had no real access to water, and it just meant that the army was dropping like flies. And so the decision was made to abandon this assault in Hispaniola and instead attack Jamaica instead. Now, Jamaica was much more easy to capture, largely because the island wasn't really inhabited much by the Spanish. They hadn't really done much of it so far, and so consequently, when the English fleet arrived there, they landed on the island, and the Spanish simply fled. They didn't have the resources to defend themselves, and very quickly, negotiations were underway for the surrender of the island. It was surrendered, and by mid-May, the English really had it under their control. But immediately after that island had been captured, the decision was made by William Penn and Robert Venables that they were going to return home with the majority of the fleet. It clearly hadn't been successful, this expedition, so far. So many of its troops were already dead, and their presence in the area had been alerted to all Spanish authorities. They'd really failed. they hadn't achieved what they set out to do, and Jamaica was largely kind of seen as a consolation prize. And Penn and Robert Venables left with more than half of the fleet. Now we can see here on this map all these different red kind of ships are all the different locations that the Gloucester actually visited during its time in the Caribbean. So you kind of going from the right hand side, it starts off at Barbados, then it sails up to St. Lucia on its way to Hispaniola, then it briefly stops at St. Kitts before having that assault on Hispaniola, the largest island in the Caribbean, and then finally, of course, capturing Jamaica, which you can see there. But it also, after Penn and his fleet leave in June 1655, it also carries on the Gloucester, and you can see it continues with assaults in Colombia, and even sets off around Cuba at one point as well. So yeah, when William Penn left Jamaica, he of course needed to put someone else into command, and strangely, he appointed William Goodson, who was, of course, already Vice Admiral of the fleet, as the new admiral. And William Goodson was also appointed as captain of the Torrington at the same time. But yeah, William Goodson was appointed the admiral of the fleet, which perhaps might be seen strange considering that maybe he was to blame for the loss at Hispaniola in the first place. But of course, he's Vice Admiral, his deputy, so perhaps it's logical that it would happen. But most significantly for our story here is that the Gloucester and its captain, Benjamin Blake, is actually appointed to be the Vice Admiral ship. Benjamin Blake is appointed Vice Admiral, and the Gloucester is informed that it should fly a Jack flag from its foremast as a reflection of that. And by Blake being appointed as Vice Admiral, this really led to the Gloucester's semi-regular use around the Caribbean, as you can see here with its assaults in Colombia and off Cuba. But also, fortunately for a historian, it also allowed Blake's voice to become more vocal and dominant in the records, thereby allowing the Gloucester story to be told. Now, the kind of big question here is, once Penn and Venables had left and that these major assaults on the Spanish islands had ended, the question was, what really should they be doing with the remaining fleet in the Caribbean? Was the fleet to continue being intended to be used to attack Spanish possessions, or really was it there just to defend Jamaica, to protect the island? And it was never really made completely clear on that. Although initially it would appear that perhaps the more aggressive assault would have been the case, because on the 31st of July, William Goodson and Blake led a squadron of 9 ships towards the Spanish Main, and they arrived in the coastal town of Santa Marta off the coast of Colombia, which we can see. And they arrived at the town on the 24th of August, and that town really was limited, had very limited defences, and it was raided simply. And the town was overcome in the space of an hour, where most of its inhabitants kind of fled into the woods. And the 200 houses and churches in the town were sacked and burned. Really, it was kind of a rather futile and worthy endeavour for really such a potent sea force. Fleets were designed to kind of compete against big threats, not just to be nuisances in the area. And really, the only major benefit from that assault on the town of Santa Marta was to obtain ordnance. 30 pieces of ordnance were captured from the fortifications of the town. And this actually led the newly appointed governor of Jamaica, an individual called Major Sedgwick, to actually comment upon the fleet returning Jamaica thereafter, that endeavour simply was not honourable for a princely navy. Yet, after this initial endeavour, perhaps because of Sedgwick's criticism, William Goodson proved much more hesitant to continue with such kind of feats, and which also may have been because death was rapidly spreading amongst the Jamaican garrison because of sickness, and that meant that Goodson really wasn't willing to kind of continue pursuing these aggressive endeavours. Although we must mention that the Gloucester and its crew did seek to sail out again to sea in an attempt to further capture Spanish holdings during the later months of 1605 and also in early 1656, which was probably done because Blake and his crew were rather bored. but it really achieved nothing. And Admiral Goodson was completely reluctant to commit to doing so, and he actually remained in Jamaica. So it was Benjamin Blake and the Gloucester that was the commander of that small squadron that really achieved nothing, but did at least sail out of Jamaica again during the later months of 1655. I think it's worth highlighting here that even at this early stage, there appeared to have been a difference in opinion between the two naval commanders, which would later cause major friction between them. Blake clearly was eager to continue attacking the Spanish for glory, I guess. Goodson didn't really want to do that, it would appear. And as a result, it wasn't until April 1656 that Goodson and Blake then set sail out again with aggressive intent, when they landed 450 men at Rio Hacha off the Colombian coast. So again, this is slightly west now to that to the assault on Santa Marta off Colombia. But again, this attempt really proved short-lived, and by the 8th of May, the squadron departed. They just again repeated the same objectives. They plundered and set fire to the town, didn't really achieve anything. The fleet then set sail further west to Cartagena, where several armed ships were sighted, but they decided because these ships were so close to the shore that they couldn't do anything to them, and Goodson decided that he was going to return back to Jamaica as a result. But on this occasion, Goodson's departure actually angered Blake, and Blake seemed to publicly question Goodson's choice in doing so. And unsatisfied with Goodson's approach, Blake instead insisted on remaining on the coast of Colombia, where Goodson, with the majority of the other, while Goodson, the majority of the other ships actually returned, the Gloucester was having none of it. Blake was going to stay there and carry on being a nuisance to the Spanish. Now, he didn't actually achieve very much. He chased the ship onto shore. That was about it. And then the ship ends up returning on the 3rd of June to Jamaica. But I guess Blake's point had been made. He wasn't satisfied with what Goodson was really doing. So this is a brief kind of summary of the Gloucester's time in the Caribbean. The only thing I haven't mentioned is that in the summer of 1656, the Gloucester spent a short amount of time blockading Havana. But that account doesn't really truly explain the experience of the crew and of Blake itself, because clearly there was more hostilities underlying in there. This short and basic account of the events washes over the vast problems that the Gloucester faced during its time in the Caribbean. And in fact, by looking deeper into the records, by kind of stepping onto the Gloucester's decks, you really find that its first voyage was one of drama, it was one of distress, and one of death as well. And it was actually under these circumstances that shortly after returning from the Columbia coast, what we just mentioned, Benjamin Blake didn't just kind of live with what happened when Goodson returned to Jamaica. In fact, he publicly denounced Goodson. And because of that, Benjamin Blake was discharged and ordered to return home because of accusations that he was planning mutinous charges directly against Goodson as Vice Admiral of the fleet. So 2 months before the Gloucester was actually sailing back home anyway, in August 1656, its first captain, Benjamin Blake, had actually been sacked. So we asked the question here, what went wrong on the Gloucester between 1654 and 1656 that caused him to be sacked? So although it may appear from the earlier slide that Gloucester was rather kind of active in the Caribbean following the departure of Penn and Venables, at least, you know, Blake was trying to push for that. I think despite that, Benjamin Blake and many of its crew really didn't think it was doing enough. Now, Benjamin Blake, who perhaps because of his brother's influence, felt that he could probably be a bit more assertive and dominant against Goodson. You know, did Goodson really dare to sack, to dismiss the brother of the General of Sea of Robert Blake, this great, powerful, and influential commander? And really, because Blake was willing to question Goodson more, it did clearly create friction in the relationship between him and Goodson. Now, the crux of their disagreement was that Goodson clearly felt that they could be more, that they should follow a more defensive use of the Navy, by defending Jamaica against any possible Spanish retaliation attempts, whereas Blake clearly believed that they should be pursuing a more aggressive policy by attacking other Spanish holdings in the Caribbean, especially failing at Hispaniola. Now, what has been missed here is that on several occasions between the summer of 1655 and 1656, Benjamin Blake, as Vice Admiral of that fleet that remained, actually submitted a number of kind of petitions and papers to the commissioners of Jamaica that advised them that the Navy wasn't being used correctly, and suggesting to them that there was a better way that it should be used. But William Goodson, of course, as Blake's superior, rejected any and all of Blake's suggestions. And when the Gloucester returned to Jamaica in June 1656 after its time off Columbia, clearly feelings between the captain and Goodson deteriorated. On entering the harbour, Blake produced another paper addressed to Goodson that openly criticised his policies. Unfortunately, we don't have the original document, but we do know that Goodson was so annoyed by what Blake had written in this paper, which was admitted to him, that he publicly denounced it by declaring it unlawful. And accordingly, Benjamin Goodson, and I quote here, described that William Goodson gave me many threatening words as that he would ruin me, or I him, or words to the like or worse effect. It's clearly evident the two men did not get on. The relationship was toxic, and the Navy was far from stable in the Caribbean at this point. Now, the altercation concluded on the 16th of June when a messenger stepped on board the Gloucester and handed a signed order from Goodson demanding that Blake remove his flag from the ship. Blake's command of the Gloucester had been abruptly terminated, and he was shortly after shipped back to England, while the Gloucester remained at Jamaica under a new captain, who was an individual called Captain Richard Newbury. Now, the most incriminating account of Blake's wrongdoings really comes from Goodson's own hand. Writing back to John Thurlow in England, Goodson wrote, "Benjamin Blake was a person of such a turbulent spirit, and he was so opposite to me in most of my commands, that in regard of my duty to his highness and his affairs, I could not but think it necessary to remove him." End quote. So, you know, what Goodson was clearly saying there is, I couldn't work with him. It was impossible to actually to operate this kind of mission here with Blake because he was questioning everything I do. You know, the two clearly had reason, of course, to be opposed to each other. Aside from the differing views regarding naval operations, Goodson's reputation amongst his men had already been tarnished, it should be remembered, because of his decision to land the troops at Point Nizel back in April 1655 at the assault of Hispaniola, which therefore would have made him instantly a target, because he was a controversial choice to be made admiral on Penn's departure in June. Why would you appoint someone who people doubted actually knew what they were really doing? Was he responsible for killing so many men on the island and for resulting in the failure on the original assault? And Blake, as second in command to Goodson, really did prove willing to openly criticise Goodson's policies as a result, which was perhaps made much easier because of Goodson's blunder in Hispaniola. And as a result, it would seem that Blake was really only one voice amongst many who were aggravated by the Navy's actions in the area. And indeed, Goodson, actually writing after the event, wrote that Blake was the head of a developing faction on that directly opposed him, with Blake, and I quote here again, "Blake, by his frequent feastings and entertainments only to that purpose, seduced a great party in the fleet, so that it was more than probable that nothing could be done therein by any ordinary way." End quote. So it wasn't just Blake who was opposed to Goodson. There are many people who are really annoyed by him. Goodson was a very questionable choice indeed to be leading affairs there. So evidently, by this quote, Blake had been encouraging others in the squadron to support his opinions and actions against Goodson. And so truthfully, the Gloucester's first captain was really something of a renegade who was leading an already disgruntled body of both landsmen and seamen to voice their complaints against an admiral who had already made a costly mistake during the design. And Goodson, by dismissing Blake, was really trying to act quickly to prevent the situation from escalating towards total anarchy, towards mutiny. But kind of looking below the Gloucester's deck, there were clearly other reasons what would influence Blake's decision to kind of openly criticise Goodson that he did. Blake's actions and consequent dismissal was also a result of the low morale amongst the fleet, and that was in part due to a great quantity of deaths in the Caribbean. Now, some of these were, of course, a result of battle, including those lost in the assault on Hispaniola, but a far greater proportion of the men lost were because of disease that spread across the army and the fleet. Deaths were reported daily from an outbreak of disease, which was most likely yellow fever, it would appear. And as a result, a temporary hospital was built on shore in an attempt to isolate those who were sick from the healthier men on deck. And actually, through the survival of wills from the Gloucester, we can get a clear sense of the poor conditions that these people endured. And we can see a list on the screen here of some of the seamen who are known to have died of sickness while serving on the Gloucester. What we have here is just 15 names of a much greater number in the squadron who certainly died from sickness. And this led William Goodson to acknowledge the situation when he wrote back to home in January 1656. He described that, quote, "There are many of the best and stoutest men snatched away by death. It doth concern me that when you think you have a very considerable fleet abroad, you actually have rather a shadow than a substance," end quote. Indeed, a report produced in June 1656, so the very month that Blake openly criticised Goodson and he was dismissed from his command, I think that this is important here, on that very month, the Gloucester is recorded as having the most cases of sickness out of any of the 24 ships that were in Jamaican harbour, while actually its crew had been reduced to 247. So it was kind of running at a far more reduced rate that the crew's friends were dropping. I think it'd be nice here to give you an example of a couple of the wills of the Gloucester's crew, which really gives you a sense of what was happening to the ship while it was there. So here we have one of the individuals, a man called Alexander Leeds, who's just recorded as a seaman. And you can see here the second and third line of this document. He is recorded as belonging to the good frigate called the Gloucester, but he being very sick and weak. In fact, this is very kind of standard language used in all these wills. They're all referred to as being very sick and weak, but they're perfect memory to write this will. And so this man, Alexander Leeds, he asked that his body simply is to be bestowed with decency as conveniency shall serve. Now, we do know that in December 1655, the Gloucester is in the Jamaican harbour. So it's quite possible that Alexander Leeds could have been buried in Jamaica. But as we know, often people were buried at sea as well. It's not quite clear what happens, but he just simply says that it's to be bestowed with decency as convenient. What's quite surprising, I think, in a lot of these records, a lot of these individuals aren't necessarily young men who, you know, are expendable, who could kind of flee away from home, and there wouldn't be anyone waiting for them. But actually, that's not the case. You see with these wills that a lot of them have dependents. Alexander here, he was married to Margaret, and he lived in Suffolk, and actually had 2 children as well, John and Joseph. So he died in Jamaica, having been away from his family for a considerable amount of time. We also get from these documents an idea of the wider crew on the Gloucester, because they often mention them. For example, here Alexander is recorded as wishing to give his clothes on the ship to another seaman called William Roy. And also in the last lines of this document, you also see other people who were surrounding him on the Gloucester, members of the crew. So we have William Marin there, John Locke, who's the scribe, and Anthony Malibran. So we get an understanding of the wider crew. I'll just give you one more example of the wills as well. This individual here called John Watson. This is probably one of my favourite cases. So John Watson, his will is dated the 21st of October, 1656. So this is after Benjamin Blake had been dismissed, this will. And what's interesting to be seen here is because it actually states it on this second and third line again. We don't have Benjamin Blake recorded as a captain. It says the Gloucester frigate is under the command of Captain Richard Newbury, the individual who replaced Benjamin Blake. What I find quite sad about this document is its late date. By being signed the 21st of October 1656, this was actually days before the Gloucester actually returned to England. He almost got back home, but yet didn't, of course. He missed it, and because the sickness was accompanied them as they were travelling back to England. But he does again state here that regarding his body, he just says, "For my body to be stowed with such conveniency as occasion shall permit, when need requireth." So maybe in this case they were so close to home that his body was kept in storage and maybe shipped back to his wife, although I suspect that's probably not the case, sadly. But yes, again, same case as I just mentioned. He has a wife, and his wife was someone called Elizabeth. And interestingly, in John Watson's case, he wasn't English; he was Scottish, coming from Fife or Fife. Again, he also has children, and in fact, I think he might have been a relatively wealthy individual. Maybe he was an officer on the ship of some sort, maybe a midshipman or something like that, because he gives his house to his daughter, who was also named Elizabeth. So again, that shows someone of probably middling age, but it also shows someone who actually has some status attached to themselves. But again, we get the sense of the wider crew, because it does say that his clothes and chest on the ship were going to be given to an individual, someone called Human Creth on there. But while again, you can see at the bottom some of the other names and the individuals who were on board, including again that same scribe was still there, John Locke, although he's referred to as John Lockyer in this case as the scribe. Another case I think of this really low morale that influenced Blake's decisions to kind of be an insurgent character at the end was that the fleet was insufficiently victualled and supplied. Given that food needed to be preserved for many months at a time, the ships were fitted with lead-lined bread rooms, which were kind of placed at the bottom of the hull near the bows, and that was done to keep goods dry. But despite that, by the time they actually reached the Caribbean, many of the bread rooms were actually found to have been split, which caused the food to be corrupted and therefore unfit for consumption. Furthermore, there's plenty of records at this time that describe how vermin was destroying the provisions, and also the ships were actually being damaged by woodworm, which were kind of eating through the wood in the ships. And actually, there was an insufficient number of carpenters actually to repair these vessels. Furthermore, the cordage and the sails of the ships was all worn. And this gives you an idea of how aware they were of this situation. This is an inventory on the screen of how much of the various resources the fleet had left. Indeed, in June 1656, so again, that very month that Benjamin Blake denounces Goodson and he's consequently removed from service, in that very month there was a report that determined that provisions for the fleet was proven to be unsustainable, which the captains of course would have been aware of, and that was because a recent delivery of goods was found to include, quote, "stinking meat and not fit for use," end quote, while a great quantity of brandy ordered in place of beer was also found to be lost because of its poor storage in wooden casks. Furthermore, not only were ships being poorly supplied with food, but they were also inadequately stocked with materials required to repair and maintain the vessels. As an example here, while remaining off the coast of Cartagena in 1656, the Gloucester sprung a leak, and there simply wasn't the resources and infrastructure available to adequately repair it, with water actually recorded as entering its hull at a rate of 2 feet every 4 hours. That was one of the reasons that forced the Gloucester to return to Jamaica. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that when the Gloucester did reach Jamaica and Benjamin Blake did get really heated with William Goodson, it's probably not surprising why. There's all these circumstances that are all stacking up that to show that things were not rosy there. And I think Blake probably did have reason to raise people's attention to it, although perhaps he may not have approached it in the right way. Finally, I'd also like to highlight religion here, because Blake's feud, his dismissal from the Gloucester, and his ultimate return to England, I think all had a religious motivation that has hitherto really been recorded. And this is related to the former captain's decision upon returning to England in late 1656 after being removed from service. It's based on Benjamin Blake's decision to actually instantly become a member of the independent church and meeting house of Stepney once he returned to England. Now, Stepney had a large maritime community, and its pastor was an individual called William Greenhill, who, of course, was a well-respected and moderate preacher who was very well connected to the Cromwellian regime. And Greenhill actually often recommended godly mariners for appointment as naval officers as well. The Stepney Church really was quite prestigious thanks to Greenhill, and Blake actually, on becoming a member of this church, actually become really heavily invested in it, which maybe is quite surprising, Rays. And in fact, on the 9th of March 1658, he was so invested that he actually was elected a deacon. So his decision to join Stepney, I would argue, is related to, and perhaps triggered by, his command of the Gloucester. Given Robert Blake and Benjamin Blake's shared upbringing in naval service, I think Benjamin's confessional beliefs probably matched those of his brother in many respects. We know that Benjamin Blake was certainly a Puritan, but he was strongly opposed to the fifth monarchist who controlled Parliament until its dissolution and defeat in December 1653. I think really Blake was against any sort of kind of anarchy that religion could unfold. He was a bit more moderate in that regard. Now, bearing in mind that while in the Caribbean, there are allegations of Anabaptist meetings occurring on shore, which Blake would have witnessed. I think these allegations of Anabaptist meetings perhaps may infer fifth monarchists, I think one could argue. And it's likely that Benjamin's requesting to join Stepney Meeting House was actually a reaction to what he'd seen in the Caribbean, because he likewise was associating religious radicalism with the squadron's disorder. Now, to kind of further reinforce this, to understand this, it's important to note that William Goodson, of course, Benjamin Blake's almost kind of opponent in this controversy, William Goodson was actually a long-standing member of the radical separatist Jupiter Church. Now, this meant that the commander-in-chief, Goodson, the vice admiral, Blake, as well as many other land and sea officers, actually all held differing confessional beliefs in this isolated environment in the Caribbean. For Goodson, the London-based Jupiter Church actually consisted of a group of dissidents who insisted on a closed communion and denounced contact with parish churches. And in fact, they did actually support rebaptism as a way of cleansing themselves of previous Anglican practices. Now, allegations of Anabaptist meetings during the Western design may have been known. In fact, it almost certainly was made in the knowledge of Goodson's own ideology. And Goodson wasn't alone, as several other naval officers with radical religious beliefs accompanied him there. Rear Admiral George Dackins was described as an Anabaptist, and Captain Richard Newbury was accused of denying the Trinity. And the result was the very disorder that Blake sought to avoid on the Gloucester, with radicalism at the very top of the squadron's command, causing great unrest. I think this is reflected actually in a great quote from John Daniel, who's the Auditor General of the Army following the capture of Jamaica. And he described the situation there, saying that, quote, "Many such vile, unworthy expressions have many of that religion, I mean Anabaptists, expressed against us and the power we act under. It's so domineering because of their present commands at sea." End quote. That seems to me like a very clear and direct target at Goodson there. The problems caused by the employment of radical naval officers to senior roles was not exclusive to the Caribbean, it should be added, but instead was actually part of wider issues from the Protectorate over religious toleration. While complaints and tensions grew amongst the fleet over the growth of radical Anabaptists, the same debates were actually also being expressed in the British Isles, with Oliver Cromwell calling for liberty of conscience in his speeches in the Commons in 1654, which was, of course, opposed by Parliament. This dispute caused instability both at home and evidently abroad as well. And it was within this arena of multi-confessional beliefs that Blake's decision to denounce and attempt to reform the fleet's order and structure and eventually become a member of the Stepney Church probably should be understood. The Gloucester's captain had experienced the disorder produced from radicalism in the Navy, which of course was led by Goodson, the very man that he'd had regular disagreements with, and his actions in June 1656 against Goodson were probably a response. So, coming to a conclusion kind of here, I notice we're very close to the hour. So the Gloucester and its crew endured extreme hardships. Bloodshed, disease, hunger, malnourishment and idleness fostered the conditions for a near mutiny that targeted William Goodson. Now, the transatlantic amphibious scheme was the most ambitious feat of the English Navy to date, I would argue. But clearly, it was underprepared and it was unsustainable at sea as well as on land. It was ill-equipped and often inactive, and it was conflicted over the design's objectives. Now, I hope that this paper has shown that the atmosphere in the Caribbean was one of unrest and that there were really many ingredients that had filled that boiling pot. And it was the Gloucester and Benjamin Blake as its captain that were really the central ingredient that led to it boiling over. The Gloucester's experience in the Caribbean shows that the Cromwellian war machine was unstable, conflicted and challenging to manage. We only need to look at similar occurrences at home to see why. Disputes and uncertainty over religion, questions over appropriate leadership, and a wider willingness to destabilise and in some cases overthrow social and power structures. We could just as easily be referring to Cromwellian England there as we could about the Caribbean and the Gloucester. So in many ways, the ship was a kind of mini Commonwealth, and the Gloucester was in many ways a microcosm of the state, which far away from home and in the conditions that it faced was more likely to break. So the Gloucester may not have been wrecked in 1655 or 1656. Of course, that fate would not occur until 1682, but it did nearly implode in the Caribbean. And it wasn't from gunpowder, but it was from unrest and from anarchy amongst its crew. And I will briefly just also mention that if you've been interested by this topic, there is an article that I wrote on this topic, and it's freely available and open access at the Historical Journal website. So do please take a look at that if you're interested in the area. Thank you.
And thank you very much for a fascinating and enthusiastic presentation there. And yes, I can strongly recommend for anybody who hasn't read Ben's article, do go and have a look at it. It is freely accessible, and it digs far more into some of the themes that he's been talking about this evening. So it's well worth a read.
Thank you. I hope that there wasn't too many issues with that break in the middle there.
No. I think we'll cover that, and it was absolutely fine. And don't worry. And for the recorded version, we'll edit that out. So it's the beauty of editing and digital whatever. So, lots of questions already popping up in the chat, which I'll come to in just a second. I'm going to pose one to sort of just quickly start us off. So, do we think the Western design failed because of all the sort of divisions and incompetence, or is the divisions actually a factor because of the design's failure? If that makes any sense, the fact of if it's all gone swimmingly, if they turned up there in Hispaniola and invaded, everybody would have been fine. But then the fault lines that are already there, those are fractured apart as a result of the military disaster. Or does the military disaster happen because of those fractures that are already there? Or is it a combination of the two?
It sounds like a bit of a question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, really.
It does, doesn't it?
A very typical historian. It's really, truly a bit of both. I think how it was prepared led it to disaster, but I truly believe that the fleet really was a representation of similar affairs that were happening at home. There was disorder at home, so it's unsurprising that when the fleet is away, of course, so far away across the Atlantic, without that structure to kind of control and control these individuals, it was going to lead to anarchy. And to kind of further reflect that, if you just look at some of the people who are being kind of recruited for this scheme, it's perhaps not surprising. We kind of looked today at some of the officers who clearly had differing views, both religious and political. But also you can look at the crew for the same way. So many of these individuals weren't volunteers. They were pressed into service, and they're not just pressed to kind of fight close to the kind of English shoreline. They're being dragged to the other side of the world for them, and many of them would not ever return again, of course. So where being forced to do that's going to create some hostilities in the first place that is going to be difficult to manage. It's also worth mentioning, actually, that when the Gloucester and the rest of the fleet do get to Barbados and they actually expand the fleet and expand the army thereafter by conscripting people off the islands, they're conscripting Scottish individuals and Irish individuals. Many of them are actually prisoners of war and so forth, following Cromwell's kind of earlier assaults on those areas. So again, these are individuals who aren't happy with the English design as it is anyway. It is already a divided kind of scheme in the first place. So, with that in mind, is it surprising that these people are fighting? It's
yeah, snowball effect of disaster, really, isn't it? Yeah. Question from Robin Liz here. Why was there such an expansion of the Navy at the time? Is this foreign fear of foreign navies? This is in the wake of the sort of, the Republic fearing reprisal, isn't it, really?
Yeah, you're quite right, really. Yeah. When you execute a king, it's going to shock the European scene, to say the least, and they were expecting repercussions. And England is an island, and it has a moat. You defend yourselves, and the fleet is the way to really achieve that. And it is initially kind of used in that way. The royalists do develop a small kind of own personal private fleet, and they do use it, and the Navy is kind of initially used for that purpose. But when hostilities begin developing with the Dutch are a major maritime power by the mid 17th century, in a way that England perhaps isn't quite there yet, especially when we're talking about military sea power. And so it does need to expand its fleet quite considerably. Charles I attempted to do it before, of course. In the 1630s, he implements the ship money scheme, of course, attached to make individuals pay to develop this navy that can defend the kingdom. But of course, that was a bit of a failure. We all know how popular Charles was thereafter and what happened as a result. The country is aware for quite a while that they need a strong navy in order to survive, and I think it's really Cromwell, and actually it's also slightly before Cromwell becomes Protector. It is really it's from around kind of 1649 that the navy does start expanding, and so there is an awareness from quite an early stage that we need to build here to survive.
Just an observation from Kevin here. Hello, Kev. This is Kev from the National Civil War Centre in Newark, our friends there, saying warships are still cramped spaces, although not as bad as the 17th century. That's an ex-Royal Navy man there telling you that. You can tell.
Yeah. You're not right. I always find it fascinating if anyone gets the chance to go to HMS Victory in Portsmouth, and you go to lower decks, and when you really have to duck down considerably in order to kind of get around, it really gives you that immersive environment and makes you realise that these are very cramped and not particularly facilitating environments.
Right. Okay. I'll spin through quite a few of these because we've quite a lot here. Rob and Liz, how experienced in naval warfare and landings were the admirals, given the fact that there weren't that many naval battles in the civil wars in this period anyway? The sort of naval warfare was not, as you say, England's forte at this point.
That's a very valid point, actually. So it's a good question. So let's use the examples. Robert Blake, Benjamin Blake, they were both land officers during the civil wars. Robert Blake, I think, is involved. I think it's the assault on Taunton, is it? I believe. Yeah. And they are that's where first and foremost they come from. In the case of those two brothers, they also were interested in merchant affairs before that stage, so they had some kind of relation to the sea, but they weren't experienced in sea battles in any stretch of the imagination. And that's truthfully, that is a really fair point. The majority of these individuals who take up command at sea, they don't have experience in the Navy, not much anyway. Benjamin Blake, we've got records where he's a sea captain from around 1648, 1649. So he's got a few years of experience by the time of the Western design. And in fact, there is a record that suggests that actually in some sort of merchant adventure before the design, he'd actually been to the Caribbean before. So he's also got a little bit of knowledge of the area. So he's kind of started to shape his sea legs. But these aren't people who have spent their lives at sea. They're in fact, that's something that develops with the next generation, really. It's not with this generation, but what they are is that they do have experience at how to command men and how to structure them, and what the new model army does do, and is influential for the Navy, is to get that kind of structure in place, which is quite important. It's something that it doesn't have before. Which is why I think is why as well Benjamin Blake, Robert Blake is so celebrated in the 17th century. A man who isn't necessarily experienced as a naval commander before the kind of Commonwealth period really begins. It's quite surprising that he's successful at sea, especially against the Dutch, and wins so many great battles. So
he's the one man that Nelson always said that he was the only person Nelson ever bowed to in reputation. So that's high praise indeed.
Absolutely.
Observation from John here, John Gillibrand, who's been doing a bit of research on Goodson, having looked him up on the Dictionary of National Biography, says he apparently still seemed to be living in 1680 and may well be the Goodson, an old seaman reported in 1680 to have sounded out the mariners in Redriff and Wapping during the exclusion crisis, seeking assurances that they will be right and true Protestants and will throw their officers overboard. So he seems to be causing trouble even still then.
Yeah, and to add another nugget there, you're completely right on Goodson. Benjamin Blake is the same. Exactly at that same period, Benjamin Blake survives into the Restoration period, and in 1681, when he hears that James II has become king, and James II, of course, a Catholic, Benjamin Blake, with the views on the church that he holds, he decides to actually to set up ship and actually ends up living in North Carolina instead. So they're both around and not happy with what happens with religion, even though they hold differing views on it.
Again, it's the thing that unites them is what they don't want. So yeah. Well, they can agree on what they don't want, but not what they do. Exactly. Question from Eric here. John Lambert was listed on your list earlier on as a ship's captain. Is he any relation to General John Lambert? Do we know anything about him?
Good question, actually. I haven't checked on this, whether it is, but it would make sense. I suspect, as is often the case with many of these offers, that he's probably the father of General John Lambert, I would assume. But it's worth me checking on that. I'm not 100% sure. It's in the same way a lot of the these individuals cross over both into the Civil War and actually into the Restoration as well, and their families do as well in different roles. They seem to be able to adapt quite easily to different occupations. But yes, I should check on that. I'm not 100% sure. Sorry.
Question from Colin. Was the design, we think, a useful way to get unruly elements out of England? Is this a way of sweeping the jails and what have you, and, you know, getting rid of a few folk you don't want around anymore? Or those who are going to cause trouble in a religious sense, I suppose, as well?
You know, that's a really challenging one to say. I wouldn't necessarily state that it was to get those challenging folks out, because there was, of course, still many who remained at home. There was another attempted mutiny in the late 1650s with the Navy, where we have essentially fifth monarchists potentially kind of getting involved again. So it's not the only case where this happens. It's a challenging one, really, to kind of give a conclusive answer on. Really, he's because it is such a ambitious undertaking. There is such a huge amount of people required to do this. They've never sent a fleet of this size across the Atlantic before, and so I think it's probably unfair just to say that it's just the individuals, people they don't really want, who are kind of sent off there. Because some of the individuals who there are important. Of course, William Penn and Robert Venables are important figures in their own right. I think really they might have kind of held some control over the situation. It's, of course, when they leave and it's left to their kind of the lesser kind of officers with Goodson, that anarchy really does seem to unfold.
Question from Bandit Queen here. Is this, you know, what's the relations with Spain here? Presumably going off and trying to conquer Spanish colonies here is going to end up leading to war. Let's face it here, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it was kept so secretive the whole way through. So they weren't officially at war with Spain when in December 1654 they sail off to the Caribbean. But of course, this sets it off. In fact, it's so secretive, this expedition initially, that most of the captains of the ships, including Benjamin Blake, wasn't actually told they were going to attack Hispaniola. There's actually a lovely document in the National Maritime Museum, which is addressed to Benjamin Blake, and it's a letter which literally says, "Don't open this letter unless your ship, the Gloucester, gets lost and detached from the fleet." And when it opens, it says, "Meet us at Hispaniola." So that the captains were just meant to follow the rest of the fleet without actually knowing where they were going. Because they didn't want it to get spooked to the Spanish or what they're actually doing. There was fears from the French at this time that actually were they about to attack them instead. Of course, they didn't. But it's a very well planned expedition, the Western design, in some respects, because what I haven't discussed here is while the fleet has sailed off to the Caribbean, another fleet under Robert Blake actually goes to the Mediterranean, blockades Spain to prevent the Spanish ships from actually sailing off the Caribbean and relieving the efforts that are going on there. So it's well thought out, and the Spanish are kind of caught in it, but it does result in a very long, drawn-out war, which doesn't conclude until the Restoration.
Question from Jordan. One of the scandals around the Western design is the use of the fleet in the Caribbean, despite the pleas of the envoy from Venice, again asking for aid against the Ottomans. Do you think there is any evidence of those involved who felt that the Western design was not worth the fighting, and that adding to the morale problems? Do some of the officers think they'd be better employed elsewhere, you know, dealing with the Ottomans?
Yeah, especially while they're in Jamaica, there are people there who just say they just want to give up. When the disease is spreading as it is, they just want to go back home. They have no interest in capturing this. Jamaica at the time is not seen as a great prize. It is seen, as I mentioned earlier, it's a consolation prize at best, because the Spanish haven't done anything with it. Which is ironic, because of course Jamaica does become so very pivotal and important to the British Empire going forward, but at that time it wasn't perceived that way. The Ottomans are an interesting question. It's they're a nuisance, especially to kind of British trade in the Mediterranean, which becomes even more of a nuisance in the Restoration when Charles II acquires Tangier. At this time, I don't think Cromwell necessarily wants to start a war against another enemy, especially an enemy that probably isn't as bothered by the execution of Charles I as many of its kind of Christian neighbours would have been.
Two very quick questions to finish on then from Bandit Queen. Do we know anything about the makeup of the people who were living on Jamaica when the sort of, you know, when obviously the Commonwealth captures it? You know, who is living there at the time? And then a good thing to finish on here. Can you give us a quick summary? What happened to the Gloucester in the end? Can you talk a little bit through the sort of circumstances of it then disappearing beneath the waves in 1682?
Certainly. Okay, so on the first, yes, so Jamaica, it was literally a very small town called Iago de Valega, I think it is, which later becomes just known as Spanish Town, and it has a small population at the time, but it is being used for the slave trade as well. There are slave inhabitants there, and once the English get to the island and the Spanish flee, it actually results in a lot of those enslaved individuals. They actually flee into the wider island, and they live there for many years thereafter, developing their own kind of communities. As they kind of head up towards the mountain area. So there are both slaves, and I'm talking West African enslaved individuals here, but there was also actually some native individuals who were left there as well, who'd also similarly been enslaved for that reason. So most of the Spanish flee, and they end up actually fleeing, going on shore and going to Cuba instead. But many of the other enslaved individuals stay there, and they actually develop their own communities as a result. Regarding the kind of wider history of the Gloucester, so it actually continues under the Commonwealth. It participates in many kind of conflicts during the Anglo-Spanish War that results, and then participates during the Restoration in the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars. But what ends up happening to it is in the late 1670s, early 1680s, it's made pretty evident that Charles II is not going to have a legitimate male heir to the throne. And because of that, his brother, James, Duke of York and Albany, he is next in line. He's going to become king, but he's also a Catholic. And there's a large controversy that happens in Parliament called the Exclusion Crisis, which they attempt to essentially remove him from the line of succession because of being Catholic. England's a Protestant country. We can't have a Catholic as king. And because of that, James is actually told by his brother to essentially go into exile in Scotland for several years while Parliament attempted to remove him from the line of succession. Eventually, in 1682, the line that fails, and James is invited to return back to England because Parliament eventually essentially accepted him as being the next in line to the throne. He comes to London without his wife, who's also in Scotland at the time, and attempts kind of dips his toes in the water to see if he is going to be accepted again. And good news, he is accepted, and that's when the Gloucester comes into it. So the Gloucester is summoned to pick him up from London and then take him all the way up to Edinburgh, where he's going to collect his wife and settle his affairs there. But ironically, the Gloucester, although it's a great ship, it's a very large ship, and so very suitable for the to transport James to Edinburgh. It's also, by being a large ship, it's perhaps not suitable to usually sail that far up north, where there's a number of sandbanks which you could hit. And on the 6th of May 1682, the Gloucester at 4:30 in the morning strikes one of those sandbanks, and it's underwater within an hour with considerable loss of life. James leaves it much too late leaving the ship. He and because of policy at the time, nobody else could leave the ship until James did. And because he left it late, there wasn't enough time to remove so many other people, the crew, off the ship. And because of that, some of them die. And yes, that's the story of the Gloucester until 2007, when it was found again.
The story doesn't stop there, I'm sure, over the coming years. Ben, that's been absolutely fascinating. And, there's lots of comments already appearing here in terms of comeuppance from people who've thoroughly enjoyed the talk tonight. it's a ball of enthusiasm, and it's been great to listen to you this evening. And we look forward to seeing the publication when it finally comes out, with the sort of the detailed history of the Gloucester in the coming years to come. I'll ask everybody to give the usual silent Zoom round of applause to Ben in just a second, just to remind everybody that next week's talk is the final one in this autumn series, and that's Dr. Hannah Jeans from the University of York, who's talking about women's writing during the Civil Wars, which is very appropriate because it ties in with our next exhibit, which opens on the 2nd of December, which Hannah's been advising us with, which looks at the role of women during the Civil Wars. So if you want to know more about how some of the evidence for that, some of the stories that went through women's own writings in this period, which is far more than so many people might have thought, please do join us for that next week. If you've got season tickets, then you'll be getting the details for that around on Tuesday, and the link for this talk, the recording of it, will be around tomorrow. Ben, thank you so much again, and huge silent round of applause. Thank you very much indeed.